In the universe of regular show, like a good series inspired by various scientific fiction, life isn't limited to planet Earth. This universe is full of different planets, dimensions, and beings of all kinds. But the creator was obsessed with finding the embodiment of the perfect ideal of existence, the perfect living being. But all these experiments failed, also with the humans, until on a distant planet, amid beings known as Cranus, Mega Cranus is born, a life form so pure and perfect that the universe had to create an equally opposing force to maintain its balance. And this was Mega Cranus. Every 14 million years, the two beings meet on their home planet, Lolli-land, for a battle to decide the universe's future. However, it always ends in a draw, which prevents further existence and returns the entire multiverse to the beginning of creation. This battle has happened dozens of times in different ways, but always ended in a draw. So this blow between the two brothers is basically the Big Bang of the regular show universe. On Earth in the 18th century lives a young yeti named Wax. He was an adventurer, and one of his dangerous hobbies was hunting timonados with his friend Samson. During one of these hunts they fought with two crazy time travelers, and Wax took a trip to the future. Since then Wax has taken a different path than Samson, who has now changed his name to Tecmo, and in the future will have a cyborg body that will let him live for many years. Wax then got into school but kept getting expelled because he was constantly fighting until he settled in a school with a principal who seems to be an ancestor of Benson. There he also met Mona, the love of his life. They lived happily, and one of his favorite pastimes was skipping around the school. And there he also meets Gary, the guardians of eternal youth, and his evil brother Claude Bane the Destroyer, who bullied his brothers because he also wanted to be part of the council. On the day of the prom, Claude Bane challenges Ander to a fight, but he strictly refuses because Mona didn't want that. But the inevitable happens. He fights Claude Bane and wins it, but due to an accident he ends up losing his beloved girlfriend Mona. In return for his help, and so that he can help them again in the future, the Guardians of Eternal Youth decide to gift Ander immortality, but to do so, he'd have to change his name. So he honors Mona by changing his name to Skips in memory of their happy time together and promises to skip for the rest of his life. Now we jump to the mid-1940s, to a man named Mr. Maillard, a war veteran who claims he has traumas that make him sleep with his eyes open. He then traveled the world looking for meteorites and resold them at very high prices, amassing a large fortune and becoming greedy. During one of his expeditions he landed in front of a different meteorite. He was carrying a small baby with a giant head, and that was Mega Cranus. Still, without knowing his true story, he named him after Pops, who grew up as the adopted son of Maillard. He had a perfect life and lived in a world of fantasy. Maillard bought a park originally founded by Curtis Montgomery, and that's why we can see a statue in his honor in the middle of the park, where Pops grew up happily and always had a strange attraction to space, more specifically to a mysterious pink planet that appears every 25 years. His dream was to visit this distant planet, whose name he didn't know. But something compelling happened. He felt a great energy. Right after that, Skips got a job in the park and met Pops as a kid. Since then he always stayed in his job. Moving forward, we come to the birth of Mitch, better known as Muscle Man, who likes to make bad jokes and use his mother as an insult.
If you say your mom, you're fired!
My mom!
Get out!
It was worth it!
He learned to be like this from his father, who claimed to be a truck driver so Mitch would be proud of him, but in reality he was just a forklift operator. And don't think his nickname Muscle Man is tongue-in-cheek, because that's what he really was. One day he was at the gym with his father, and he went to save him from a barbell that fell on him, and his muscles grew immediately. From there, he entered the world of bodybuilding, but later he got tired and lost his shape after starting to participate in eating contests, including one in which he won his trailer. Finally he went to college and met High Five Ghost there, who was very popular. At first they didn't like each other, because Muscle Man was jealous of him, but after an accident in a car race, High Five Ghost ended up helping Muscle Man, and since then they have become best friends. And in the same incident, Mr. Maillard sees that Pops cannot manage the park because he's too innocent and decides to hire someone to do it. And here's where Benson comes in. He was a child who grew up in a family with constant fighting, so he learned to be moody and temperamental, in addition to some emotional trauma. His life was full of ups and downs where he always had a great time, but in the end something went wrong. Besides this frustration, he was once an unrecognized foosball world champion and played the best drum solo in history, which helped his band gain worldwide recognition. Still, eventually he was kicked out and replaced by a robot. So he became a park manager and soon hired High Five Ghost and Muscle Man on his team. Together with Skips and Pops, they formed the parks team at the time. Everything seems normal, but the show is about to start. Mordecai and Rigby were friends from a young age. They grew up together and practically became brothers. Rigby had self-esteem issues mainly because she grew up in a family of tall people, and his father only liked his brother Don, who was younger but much taller than him. That's why he became impulsive and always got into trouble, while Mordecai was a bit more responsible and had to take over Rigby's irresponsibility. But it didn't matter, because they had each other in the end, and that was enough. Mordecai was also a bit smarter and loved music and art. In high school they decide to go to college together, but Rigby is rejected while Mordecai is accepted. Afraid of losing his best friend forever, Rigby changes the test result, making Mordecai think it didn't pass either. But he doesn't give up. They use a time machine to travel back and get them both accepted, and this creates a timonado, a time tornado, that would cause many problems in the future. This is resolved with an alternate timeline where they change their attitudes towards what doesn't happen again. But anyway, they don't pass college. Rigby still needs to graduate high school, and Mordecai was inspired by Sad Sax Guy and ended up going to study arts. But he didn't last long there either. He got discouraged because his portraits just made people cry. I'd have been pretty disappointed too. So they went looking for jobs, none of which seemed to be the right one, until they found a job in the park that wasn't the best job in the world, but they were able to stay together and had a roof over their heads. In the park they also met the rest of the team, who didn't like them so much at first, but with time they won their hearts, especially the Muscle Man, who teased them a lot at first, but that stopped when they created the Guys' Night, which is the best event to understand their friendship. In the park, Mordecai and Rigby would do any tasks. Still, their duties and actions always ended with an exaggerated absurd consequence, like a magic keyboard that makes any wish transport beings and travels to the past, or a rock-scissors-paper argument that opens a black hole, and what would be a dull job becomes the biggest wave of madness ever. Not to mention that Mordecai now meets Margaret, and falls madly in love with her. And now we come to what would be the beginning of the show. So let's at least recap the most important things. Rigby is very excited about a concert, but Mordecai only wants to go once he finds out that Margaret is going too. But they don't have the money for the ticket, so they work like crazy and do the almost impossible, and they manage to scrape together the money, but they work so hard that they can't keep their eyes open when they get there. Besides the fact that Margaret went with her boyfriend. What a waste. Another day, they interrupt a dance that Skips is doing over fire with blue fire. This is a ritual he was supposed to do to maintain his immortality given to him by the Guardians of Eternal Youth. And when Mordecai and Rigby interrupt it, Gary shows up and takes them to the Guardians. Skips is about to lose his immortality over this, but they manage to regain it by giving the babies a chocolate cake. My God, what a horrible scene. To regain Margaret, Mordecai discovers a perfume that attracts girls and makes them fall in love. But when he uses it, that's not quite what happens, but he attracts a bunch of punky unicorns who decide to help him conquer Margaret. Still, they're just having fun getting him into embarrassing situations. Rigby sticks with the unicorns at first, but they are so stupid and rude that they piss off everyone. Rigby, Benson, Skips, and the only way to get rid of them is to blow your car up in the air. Not to mention they killed the unicorns. And after passing pranks on a magic phone from Pops, they end up traveling through time and ending up in the 80s, and running over with Pops, who was apparently a normal and civilized person before this incident, which may have messed with his head. Pops has the habit of paying for everything with lollipops, and that's why he gets involved in tax problems. To solve them, they call Don, Rigby's younger brother, who is an accountant, but the condition to help them is for Rigby to hug his brother, and that is the end of the world for Rigby because he has a whole self-esteem issue with his brother. But in the end, he manages to hug and make peace with him. Later, these best friends decide to form a band called Mordecai and the Rigbys. It was nothing more than an air band without instruments to impress Margaret, so because of an electrical discharge, they end up bringing their versions of the future that are rock stars. The problem is that they do the show using the playback to gain this fame, so they go to a contest and also use playback to materialize this timeline, but in the middle of the show, they realize that this was wrong, giving up this future full of fame, which was nothing more than a farce. Mordecai's attempts to seduce Margaret don't stop there. One day he offers to help her move house. The idea is to try to take the opportunity to ask her out, but he ends up not being able to do that. And to make matters worse, Rigby gets jealous and shows up there to annoy him, and even asks Margaret to go out on a date. To make sure that doesn't happen, Mordecai takes all the clocks, changes the time, and puts everything in the microwave. But this creates a vortex in time that sucks them in, and in the middle of the trip, Rigby dies. Luckily, Mordecai knows the father of time. He apologizes and manages to reverse all that. Afterward, Benson is blamed for Mordecai and Rigby having destroyed Mr. Millard's limousine. He is demoted from his position, and a new manager enters. In this new position, he can see how good it is to spend the whole day doing nothing, having fun, and resting. After all, he is with the masters of doing this. He gets so lazy that the new manager fires him for refusing to work. Now unemployed, he finds another manager who also got tired of working, and sees that he doesn't want to be like him. Luckily, the new manager is a complete psychopath, so he gets his job back, and since then, everything is fine until the tragic day comes when Starla leaves Muscle Man, and since he is indisposed, Mordecai and Rigby have to do all their work, which is not easy at all. So to solve it, they go to Starla asking her to reconcile with Muscle Man. Still, the unexpected happens, and Starla is in love with Mordecai, and as he wants nothing to do with her, she is furious to the point of wanting to kill them, but luckily ends up realizing that Muscle Man is who she loves, and they get back together. With Muscle Man back to work, everything was easier, and now they could rest like they always did, but it seems that rest was not enough for Rigby, so he decides to hire someone to do his job, with the result that he almost becomes a Rigby's clone to take his place, but in the end, he is discovered and arrested, as things are a little slow between Mordecai and Margaret, while Eileen, who has a big crush on Rigby, ends up asking him out, but it is a double date. Her, Rigby, Mordecai, and Marguerite. That way, Mordecai ends up owing favors to Rigby, and as expected, he ends up asking for many things until Mordecai refuses to return a favor to him. Since we are talking about regular show, something bizarre would happen. They almost die because in that universe you can't owe favors. Otherwise, the cosmos of the universe is misaligned, and catastrophes begin to happen. In the end, Mordecai discovers that Margaret doesn't even want to go out with him. After all, she was doing a favor for Eileen. Tragic. After that, Rigby would end up dying. Once again, he incredibly manages to beat Skips in an arm wrestling match, but is discovered using a mechanism to cheat. So Skips gets angry and takes revenge by taking that mechanism from Rigby with so much force that he practically dies. So to reverse that, Skips must challenge death itself to an arm wrestling and manages to win, returning life to Rigby, but death was not happy with that. After all, Skips has been deceiving death for a long time with his immortal soul. And with Rigby back, they ended up accidentally meeting some cute ducklings, and would take care of them, becoming great friends. What they didn't know was that they could join forces by merging into the big giant duck man, helping them in times of trouble. Then Mordecai loses a video game bet against Rigby, even though he is cheated. As a result, he has to dye his hair blonde, so he meets other blondes, who are part of a sect, and he even enjoys being with them at first, leaving Rigby aside. But in the end, His test to be accepted into that sect was to throw his best friend Rigby into a pit of lava. It's obvious that he doesn't want to do that, so they end up having to run away from these blonde psychopaths. Their secret base ends up exploding, and Mordecai and Rigby manage to escape, but the blondes don't have the same fate. Mordecai never gives up. He invites Margaret to a camp, the most beautiful, cute, and romantic thing in the world, right? Well, it would be if there wasn't a crazy moose man wanting to eat them. And in the end, they managed to get away. And oddly enough, Margaret enjoyed spending this time with him despite everything. And as a result, she asks Mordecai to make a web page for her, but Mordecai doesn't know how to do that. And to make matters worse, they have to share the computer with Muscle Man, so they end up in a cosmic basketball dispute. And in this game, 2 months passed, which was in vain, as Eileen had already made the web page for Marguerite. The other day Mordecai sings a song declaring himself to Marguerite, but without realizing it, he ends up recording it and sending it to her. He then tries to do everything to prevent her from listening and avoid this embarrassment. He fails, but she ends up like so much of the song that she sets as her cell phone ringtone, so every time Mordecai calls her, she will hear his beautiful declaration of love. And again, because of Rigby and Mordecai, Skip ends up breaking his fingers. Only he must face Clorg Bane soon. With broken fingers he would not have made it. But Mordecai and Rigby help him using the gauntlets as if it were a video game, and so they succeed to defeat the villain. And as a reward, they could have gained immortality just like Skip's, but they only ask to help them move on a very heavy piano. These two make no sense. Now Mordecai finally decides to take the courage and talk to Marguerite. But when he arrives at the coffee shop, he sees what looks like a man asking her to marry him, and she seems to be accepting, and that ends his plans. The Mordecai gets bad. He was completely devastated. Rigby then tries to help him by arranging a bunch of blind dates, which don't seem to go anywhere, but he ends up meeting a nice girl called CJ. They make a nice and fun couple, something that never happened to Marguerite. So after spending some time with her, he ends up going back to the coffee and discovers that that guy who had asked Marguerite's hand was her cousin who was showing his new leg prosthesis. Mordecai feels like an idiot and ends up having the brilliant idea of inviting her to the cinema, but he had already asked CJ, and she arrives right at that moment to hear everything and gets furious. In the end, he doesn't stay with either of them, and CJ does not even want to be his friend at that moment. Therefore, Mordecai has a crush on Margaret again. One day she and Eileen invite them to dance at a club, but when they get there, they are turned away, spending the whole night trying to get in, only to find out later that they are in the club next door. At the end of the night, everything ends well, and Mordecai and Margaret end the night dancing together. Super cute. Then Margaret goes on a trip and asks Mordecai to water her plants in her apartment, only they end up finding Margaret's diary and accidentally end up setting fire to it. They try to fix it. Still, they can't, so they resort to magic. In the middle of the process, he ends up peeking into Margaret's secrets, which activates a kind of magical guardian, which makes them confess a secret each. So Rigby admits that he likes Eileen, but prefers her without glasses. She ends up listening to this, trying to impress him. She showed up the other day without glasses, but it didn't work out well. The four then begin to get closer, and Margaret begins to get to know Mordecai better. They go to an abandoned zoo to take a photo in the death bear's cage, which they believe to be folklore, but it turns out he is real. Mordecai is fearless in the face of this and ends up saving everyone. Margaret rewards him by giving him a very tight hug. But they weren't just in a hug. On another day, Mordecai ends up forgetting his wallet in the car. She goes to help him. There's a chemistry between them, and they end up kissing. But Margaret stops the kiss and says he has bad breath, which leaves him devastated. He then decides to use the time machine that Rigby bought for $15, and they end up making several trips and creating several alternative timelines. Finally, they have to solve this by simultaneously destroying the time machine and recreating that moment from scratch. Mordecai decides not to kiss Margaret because of her bad breath, so this kiss technically never happened. But there was a thing between them. Mordecai is very slow and could never kiss her, so Muscle Man makes a bet that he would not be able to kiss Margaret until Friday at midnight. and the loser he was going to have to wear a diaper for the whole next week. He accepts the bet to encourage him to be more courageous. Still, Margaret ends up finding out about everything and getting mad with him for betting something like that, but he explains everything he's feeling. It moves her, and when she is about to kiss him, it is also a prank, and he has to wear diapers for a week, but he happily wears it because he knows that Margaret also likes him. However, bad news arrives. She is going to change towns to go back to studying. Mordecai is sorrowful, but even so, he offers her a ride to the airport. Still, he is late because a gang called the Wickets who hate cell phones and go after him because he keeps using his cell phone in front of them. He arrives late. She thinks it's for some other nonsense, not believing the story he told, but halfway through the Wickets come back and wreck Benson's car. Nevertheless, they miraculously manage to arrive at the airport on time and Margaret apologizes. Seeing his lack of initiative, she kisses him and leaves. But even after that, he kind of stays in the friend zone for a while, until Mordecai insists a lot and finally manages to start a relationship with her. They are not necessarily boyfriends, but they go out from time to time and enjoy a lot together until she decides to present him to her family. Things were getting more serious. He tries in every way to impress her father, and for that, they end up jumping out of a helicopter and Mordecai gets his father-in-law's a handshake. Look at that evolution. Feeling that things were getting more serious, he decided that he would ask Margaret out. But on the day he was going to do it, everything went wrong because he was trying to pay the restaurant with coupons that Pops had given him at Christmas. Only those coupons were fake. But even during all this confusion, he manages to ask Margaret out on a date. But at that moment, she breaks the news to Mordecai that she had been accepted to a university and was moving, so they can't date even if it was her wish to. It shakes a lot of Mordecai, who gets extremely depressed, and one day by accident he ends up finding a sweater from Marguerite who was with him, and that is the perfect excuse for him to visit her, and do that he ends up driving all night. Halfway through, the sweater ends up coming to life, fighting against it and making a lot of problems. Still, nothing of that was worth it. They decided to decree it broke up once and for all. Then comes the new year. Mordecai has a date but doesn't like the girl very much. So he meets another girl who has chemistry and they kiss on New Year's Eve, discovering that she is CJ. It was obvious that it was her. They see each other again in a dodgeball championship. Mordecai loses to her because he was distracted. At least that served for him to reconcile and go back to being friends. Until one day he accidentally texts CJ saying he likes her, and finally the two end up getting together. In fact, CJ has much more in common with Mordecai than Margaret does, and their relationship was much healthier. And because Mordecai spends a lot of time with her, Rigby ends up spending more time with Eileen too, and so it was for months until CJ wanted to meet Mordecai's parents. Taking the relationship to a more serious level, Rigby then ends up getting used to being alone anymore and do all the work in the park, as well as spend a lot of time with Eileen. And in the meantime, a new intern at the park is hired, Thomas, a very nice guy who gained everyone's trust, but in fact he was a Russian spy, sent by Russia to copy the park system in the United States. But deep down he became friends with the guys, so he decides to betray his country and stay in the US. Then Christmas arrives and they are going to celebrate at Eileen's sweater party, but there is a problem. Margaret will also be at that party. Mordecai thinks he will be embarrassed to see Margaret, and is afraid that CJ thinks he still likes her. He gets uncomfortable and CJ noticed this, so he explains everything and she is very understanding. But when he finally goes to talk to Margaret, he remembers the memories of the good times they spent together, letting himself be carried away by the feeling, and kissing her. CJ sees this, is furious, and leaves him again, and he finds that Margaret is moving back to town to live with Eileen. So he decides to apologize to Margaret, but CJ sees it again and makes the situation even worse. Finally, Mordecai surprisingly gets CJ's apology, even getting all broken. They continue together, and one day they end up discovering an illegal spa where they use turtles as a way of rejuvenating. Only they are caught and end up being arrested. CJ decides to call Marguerite, who was working on the TV news, explaining the situation for she to expose everything. and in the end everything works out, improving the rift between the two. However, Margaret's father will have his 1000th flight, and Mordecai is invited to this festivity. CJ, who has already had her trust betrayed, becomes jealous and loses her mind, turning into a storm, but in the end she realizes that she had nothing that to worry about. After all, Margaret even had a new boyfriend, so CJ decides to apologize to Margaret, only to find out that she is not dating. So everything is very awkward between them again. But everything would change at Muscle Man's wedding to Starla. He's very nervous, but that's not the focus now. After all, Mordecai finds out that Rigby had been dating Eileen for months, which was right in the face. After all, they even had bracelets and everything, and all of that in head ends up being left for Mordecai to read the wedding letter that Muscle Man's father had written. In the middle of this letter he realizes that he doesn't like CJ that much, and he still has feelings for Margaret, but it was clueless for him to speak in the middle of everyone, and CJ is heartbroken. But she is mature enough to break up with him, hug him, and leave for good. After that, Mordecai disappears for 2 weeks, and the worst part is that Rigby doesn't even notice because he spent all his time with Eileen. He only starts looking for him when Benson lectures him, finding only a postcard written by Sad Sack's guy, who invited Mordecai to Dump Town, which is basically a getaway for guys who've had a breakup and want to take a break and forget about it all. Still, it turns out this place is so good in a way that a lot of people don't end up coming back, so for Rigby to be able to go there, he convinces Eileen to break up with him, and that teleports him straight to that place. In Dump Town, the notion of time doesn't exist. Mordecai doesn't even know how long he's been there. He's looking like a good vibes hippie. It's like he doesn't care about anything, which can seem very good, but in this situation it's worrying. So they manage to get out of Dump Town thanks to Rigby's help, and everything goes back to normal. And that's when the regular show movie takes place, which tells the story of how Rigby lied about Mordecai not passing college, and that ends up triggering a war of timelines that is resolved by lots of time travel and a lot of craziness. And then the park is trapped in a dome, which is a government experiment to create a contained ecosystem for 30 days. Only Benson got the date wrong, and they end up trapped inside the dome. Not to mention that Millard made a lot of money because of this. Benson wants to get to the bottom of all this craziness going on in the park, and he discovers that this dome is actually sending the park to space. But they manage to get out, and this experiment was over. Free again, Mordecai goes back to see Margaret, and they go on a date, and this guy who predicts the future says they'll be happy together. However, in the end, they decide that they will remain friends, because they are not yet ready to resume their relationship. And Rigby has other big plans. He wants to go back to school because he doesn't have a high school diploma. And he does that because Eileen is brilliant and he feels bad. So he really throws himself into his studies and tries hard. He even goes to China to study other languages. In the middle of that, many things happen and some confusion, until comes the day of the prom that he was going to with Eileen. But the problem is that they needed a ride from his father, and they fought the whole way through, because he is still frustrated with his son, not satisfied with the choices he has had. But in the end, Rigby ends up saving everyone's lives and finally earns his father's respect. And since then everything has gone very well, until one day they dawn again with the dome covering the park, but this time it was a little different. After all, a scientist named Dr. Langer ends up putting a mysterious button in the middle of the park, which they cannot press, in addition to the fact that they could enter and leave whenever they wanted. Still, in return they are constantly watched by scientists. Only Benson ends up making friends with one of them, Pam. They have a lot in common. Soon he falls in love with her, but she is part of the experiment. They can't be together, so they make an agreement that they will go out on a date after all that is over. Another essential thing that happens in this meanwhile is that Pops wants to see that mysterious planet, and that's why he ends up using all his power for the first time to contain an electromagnetic force, moved by the motivation of wanting to see his planet. Out of there, Rigby finally managed to graduate from high school, while Eileen was also graduating from university. Everything seems to be going wonderfully well, until they decide to press the damn button. Everything was just another experiment, and when they do that, the park just leaves the ground and turns into a gigantic ship. taking all the park employees along with Eileen. It wasn't just them. Several other parks worldwide also disappeared, and now they have to survive in the space with the resources they have there. Well, at least that's what they thought, until they were rescued and taken to a larger station that brings together several other parks. There they discover that there are other space stations and that everything was done for them to explore space. Pops uses his powers again while he is sleeping at night. They realize that that was a dangerous sign and that someone was wanting to attack him. And this was Malin Cranus, his evil twin brother who keeps the balance of the entire universe. But he manages to get over it and goes back to having normal dreams. Meanwhile, Mordecai and Rigby start playing a game that is actually a training simulator, and they get pros at it. After all, they play video games for countless hours in their lives, so they end up being called into a tournament. So the Colonel thinks they are ready to travel alone to a new planet, but just on the day they were going to gain their recent ranks, Malin Cranus, also known as Anti-Pops, arrives attacking everyone. They manage to escape, but now they are offering a reward for Pops. In the middle of their trip, they come across a tape that his father has to watch, and it is on this tape that Mr. Millard tells the whole story of his life, clarifying and giving meaning to everything that was happening with the Pops. He understands his origin and also that he must fight his brother, and there's nothing better than training with a super fast Chunin-style technique. And of course there is an old sensei to train him, and that's the Master Earl. Quickly he gets powerful and is ready for battle. However, he decides he doesn't want it. He wants to try to resolve things without violence, presenting his brother with a cake to try to make peace, but that doesn't work. He throws a cake in the ground, saying that he does not believe in peace in the universe, that beings do not deserve to live, and that the destruction he will bring will be a favor to them all, starting a battle where the Master Earl ends up sacrificing his life so that they could escape. So they decide to go to the planet Lolli-land and discover that there is a battlefield where the final battle between them always happens, and the universe is reset because always it ends in a draw. Only this time they try to do something different, but nothing seems to work. The fight starts, things go from bad to worse, and almost everyone dies, except Mordecai and Rigby, who are in a ship flying between the battle. So they use their ship to try to prevent that final shock between their hands, and they end up in the first episode of the series. The beginning is identical to the original, but in the middle of it they realize what's going on and decide to use the magic keyboard to get back to Pop's battle. And seeing that his friends didn't die, motivates Pops to calm down. After all, losing all his friends is the main reason for him to lose control and end up resetting the universe. But this time he decides to do something different. He stops, breathes, and decides to change the destiny that was imposed on him. And so he flies to his brother's direction and hugs him. This hug is so strong and sentimental that he is also able to calm him down. And Pops sees the opportunity to end it all, but for that he should sacrifice himself, taking him and his brother directly to the sun, thus ensuring the continuity of the universe. Then the park returns to Earth, and they are reunited with everyone. And finally Mordecai and Rigby stop working in the park and go live their lives separately. Mordecai returns to producing his art again, and ends up meeting Steph, the woman of his life. Rigby of course stays together with Eileen, and Benson starts a relationship with Pam. He and Skips continued working in the park. 25 years later they decide to meet again in the park, taking a wonderful photo that carries so much emotion and a whole story of an incredible cartoon. And so we finish this story. Remember to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, leave your like, and see you in the next time. Bye.